All right, this is a fun one. It's called Stop Freaking Out About Your Saturn Return. The Saturn return is a transit, which basically means a planet in the sky is ticking off or triggering a planet in your birth chart. In this case, it's just the same planet, Saturn triggering your Saturn or returning to where it was when you were born. But at any given moment, most people have two or three significant transits happening that may or may not have to do with Saturn. And some of these you should freak out about, like Pluto Neptune conjunctions, Jupiter squares, and certainly things like Neptune, Sun, Mars, or Moon conjunctions, oppositions, or squares. But the Saturn return seems to have the best PR machine of any transit, and unlike those other transits, it actually is pretty straightforward. Saturn is what it is, and it's not going to throw you any curveballs, which is probably what freaks most people out about it. The Saturn return is reality setting in. It is the end of childhood for the modern person and the time when we are astrologically desiring to fully stand on our own 2 feet. But you've been there before. Every 7 years, Saturn makes what's called a hard aspect to itself in your chart, marking a rite of passage from one reality stage to another. Back in the old days, when humans rarely lived past 30, adulthood probably started at your Saturn opposition, around 14 years old. And in tribal cultures, quote, standing on your own 2 feet wasn't a huge priority since it was expected that you would never leave the tribe, go off to college, move to Brooklyn, buy a Vespa, and work at a coffee shop. So by the time of your Saturn return at 30, you were practically an elder. But for us, it takes a full rotation of Saturn around the sun to lay the physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual foundations of our lives. And each one comes with its own release period of what came before it. So around 7 years old, we start to change our teeth and become physically separate from the mother, able to function on our own physically. Around 14, we are working through puberty and become emotionally and sexually independent. From 21, we become more intellectually dependent, and particularly the last 7 years before our Saturn return, we may feel soul development and searching to discover who we are. For those of you who want to nerd out on theosophy, Rudolf Steiner has a good book about the education of the child that describes the layers of the aura developing along these stages as well, corresponding with the hard Saturn aspects. At each point in the cycle, we erect some kind of structure for ourselves, and at each inflection point, that structure breaks down as we are now able to function without it, like training wheels on a bicycle or scaffolding on a building. Once we have our balance, or once the building can stand on its own, we no longer need the external supports, and they fall away. So what people feel at their Saturn return is the scaffolding of their lives falling away. Astrologically, you are ready to start your adult life. You aren't old, but you aren't young anymore either. And in the year right before the event, there is usually an impending sense that if you want to be young and stupid, now is your last chance. There is a certain seriousness and maturity that sets in around this time, that once you have it isn't so bad, but when you're young and spontaneous might seem like the end of the world. In fact, for many artists who are professionally youthful, the Saturn return, or the whiff of it on the horizon, is often enough to make them want to go out with a bang. Hendrix, Morrison, Joplin, Ledger, these folks are all mythicized because of their early deaths. It's hard to imagine Jim Morrison retaining his cool as fuck legend status, hobbling around on a walker and drinking jello through his dentures. He was eternally youthful, and by dodging his Saturn return, he will forever be remembered that way. But I'm not recommending you do that. Particularly for Saturnian types of people and Capricorns, the Saturn return can actually be a welcome relief as you give up the frivolity of youth and get on with the business of what you're here to do. You have the independence and experience now to be taken more seriously and start to build the life of your choosing rather than just living out the patterns your parents set in place for you. So it is often said that people will get married or get divorced, start a new career or end a career, start a family or move away from their family during the Saturn return. This sounds a lot like typical astrological hedging and prevaricating, but there is actually a lot of truth here. If you got married, bought a house, or chose a career for the stability imparted when you were younger, like the scaffolding or training wheels, it may fall away at this time since you no longer need it. On the other hand, if you've developed yourself patiently, you may find that you are okay in giving up some of the endless possibility of youth and, quote, settling down into a more permanent life. For women, this can often come when the biological clock starts ticking more loudly, and in men when they get the call to build their empires. And indeed, it may not be till the Saturn square 7 years hence that you really start to hit your stride as the newly established independent adult that you now are, but may not fully realize you are at the moment of the Saturn return itself. The Saturn cycle continues after all, and you will continue to have squares, oppositions, and even late life Saturn returns forever. So if you missed some pieces this round, or you had a particularly difficult childhood and need some more time to feel truly like your own person, you will get more chances as you go. So the Saturn return is one of many, many transits you undergo throughout life. They all have their particular purpose, their particular pitfalls, and their particular lessons to show us. And frankly, many of them are a lot harder and less formally scheduled than the Saturn return. As an astrologer, I always keep up with these massive life events to help guide my own life and those of my clients through the wild and unpredictable storms of life. But the Saturn return is as good a transit as any to start to learn about the seasons of your life. It happens reliably between 28 and 31 for everybody, and then 28 to 31 years later. It can take as little as a few weeks or as long as several months to complete, depending on your particular configuration. A good astrologer can lay this out for you in detail. And its meaning can be determined by your Saturn's placement in your chart, as well as any aspects or other transits happening at the same time. It's one of the transits that is shared generationally for every generation, whereas a Pluto-Neptune conjunction is shared by everyone in a generation, but not all generations experience them at the same time in their lives, which makes Saturn, true to form, a consistent harbinger of certain life phases and transitions for everyone. Saturn is a planet of growth and maturity, of independence and self-reliance. He tests those aspects of ourselves approximately every 7 years forever, and is the sort of bedrock or backbeat of our lives, reliably impelling us forward to our next stage of maturity, wisdom, and independence, which for many young people is the most horrible thing in the world. This is why the Saturn return is often feared by the young. And yes, it's true that if you have some youthful indiscretions to get out of your system before it hits, it's not a bad idea, as long as the long-term consequences aren't too dire. Saturn keeps a tally of all our errors and misdeeds and will eventually make us pay the tab. But as long as you're not fully Saturnized in your 20s, you may want to enjoy the frivolity of youth one last time before things start to get real and you can't go back again.